Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our exploration of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your support is greatly appreciated. Kindly like and share this audiobook to extend its reach, enabling more individuals to access its profound wisdom. Remember to subscribe to our channel for instant notifications when new content is released. Together, we can propagate the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, nurturing a community focused on enlightenment and inner serenity. We thank you for being a part of our mission to make these transformative teachings accessible to all. Let's commence today's reading. The Fourth Noble Truth. November 19, 2015. As Ajahn Fuang once said, when you follow a path, even if it's one you followed many times before, you always have to pay careful attention, because today there may be new things on the path that weren't there before. Some of them may be dangerous. Some of them can be good. If you're not paying careful attention, you won't see them. You trust the path. It's always been the same path. You've walked it many times before. There's never been a snake there before. There's never been anything else dangerous. But that doesn't mean there can't be a snake now. And if you're walking in the dark without a flashlight, you put yourself in danger. So you want to look carefully at where you're going. At the same time, as Ajahn Lee once said, as you walk along the path, there may be little plants along the side of the path that you can eat. So you look carefully because paths can have both dangers and unexpected beans. These are good analogies to keep in mind as you follow the path of the breath. You breathe in and out how many times in a lifetime? And as meditators, we've probably been watching the breath for who knows how many thousands of hours. But you never know when there's going to be something new. Something good or bad in the breath, or something good or bad in the mind, because it's the mind together with the breath that makes the breath a path. The breath on its own is not a path. But the mind interacting with the breath. That's the path. And it's going to take us someplace. When the Buddha sets out the Four Noble Truths, pay attention to how he talks about the relationship between the RST and the second, i.e., suffering and its cause. For the cause, he uses the word samudaya, which means something that arises together. It's what you look for when stress or suffering comes. You want to look at what arises together in the mind along with the suffering. There's a causal relationship between the two. But in the pair of the third noble truth and the fourth, he doesn't call the fourth truth a samudaya. It's a magga. A path. In other words, the path doesn't cause the cessation of suffering to be, but it takes you there. There are many images and explanations in the canon that make this clear, such as the image of the raft going across the river. The raft doesn't cause the other shore, but it helps you get there. You put the raft together and you hold on tight to it as you cross the river. When you've reached the other side, you let it go because you're not there for the sake of the raft. You're there for the sake of the other shore. But that doesn't mean that you don't do a good job of tying the raft together, or that you don't hold on tight to the raft while you're crossing over. There's another passage where the Buddha says the Noble Eightfold Path is the path of Kamma that puts an end to Kamma. It's composed of a series of actions, but it takes the mind to something that's not an action at all. So the path is not a cause of the deathless, but it takes you there. This is why the image of the path is so appropriate. The path to the top of a mountain doesn't cause the top of the mountain to be, but it gets you there. So, as we're watching the breath and the mind together with the breath, it's a path, which means it's not the goal of what we're practicing for. But to get to the goal properly, you have to pay careful attention to the path. Watch carefully what you're doing because there may be some unexpected things here. And you want to be alert enough to see them. The texts describing how the Buddha nearly got on the right path give two different versions of which of the factors he discovered. In one version, it was right resolve. In the other, it was right concentration. But the two go together. Noble right resolve is directed thought and evaluation together with singleness of mind. These are the factors that get you into the jhana. You're supposed to put aside thoughts of sensuality, thoughts of ill will, thoughts of harmfulness. When you really stick with that, the mind will naturally fall into a state where it's pulling away from unskillful things. And you've got the breath right here to settle in on. So you direct your directed thought and evaluation to the breath. In other words, your inner chatter focuses on the breath. You want to stay right here. Of course, this builds on all the other factors of the path, but it also brings them all to fruition. Ajahn Lee has a nice explanation, saying that when the mind is in right concentration, really noble right concentration, you've got all the factors of the path together. For instance, right view. Your directed thought and evaluation are looking at where there's any unnecessary stress bearing down on the mind, and are trying to do away with whatever's causing it. Here in particular, what in the breath is uncomfortable? What can you do to straighten it out? And once you've got a sense of ease in the breath, how can you make the most of it, so that it provides a good place for the mind to settle down? As the mind settles in, which mental factors get in the way of making the concentration more solid and less stressful? What can you do to drop them? That connects directly with right resolve. You resolve on not going back to your sensual thoughts. You're going to stay right here, and to show more goodwill for the mind by making it even more concentrated. Right speech. Your internal chatter is directed to the breath and the way the mind relates to the breath. Right action. All your activities are dealing with the breath and the mind together, adjusting them this way, adjusting them that way, to see what works in giving rise to a sense of ease. Right livelihood. You use that sense of ease to provide for the well-being and maintenance of the mind. Right eart. You stick with it. If anything unskillful comes up, you just let it go and try to keep it from coming back. If anything skillful arises, you maintain it. You don't just let everything come and go. As for right mindfulness, the word mindfulness means keeping something in mind. In this case, you're keeping your breath in mind. You're also keeping in mind the need to protect your concentration on the breath. It's in this way that everything converges into right concentration, so that right concentration gathers up all the other factors of the path and makes them whole. It's good to think of the factors coming together this way, for otherwise, if you think of them as separate, you have too many different things to think about, like a mother chicken trying to gather up a bunch of baby chicks running around. Here we have only one thing to think about, which is, how is the mind relating to the breath? In the beginning, the main focus is on the breath. When you're trying to get the mind into jhana, you don't take jhana as your object. You take the breath as your object. If you approach the breath properly, the jhana will come without your having to think about it. You simply think about the breath and evaluate the breath until you get more and more absorbed in the breath. That's when the sense of pleasure and rapture can arise as a result. Then you make the most of them. That's another one of the duties of evaluation. As you're evaluating the breath to give rise to a sense of ease, you also evaluate how to spread that ease around in the body, so as to get the most use out of the ease. The Buddha compares this stage of concentration to kneading water into a ball of dough. When you're really good, you don't add too much water or too little. All the dough is moistened, and yet there's no water dripping out. What you're trying to do is to develop a sense of whole body awareness, and it comes best when things feel really good throughout the body. There's also a sense of singleness of preoccupation, both in the sense that the breath is the one thing the mind is focused on, and in the sense that the breath lets your awareness here in the body, so that the body is one mass of breath energy. Then as you stick with this, the relationship of the mind to the breath gets more solid to the point where you don't have to do any of the directed thought and evaluation anymore. You're just there with the breath. There's a sense of unity, of unication. The breath and the mind seem to merge into one. You follow this through the next levels of jhana until you nearly get to the fourth, where everything in the body is so well connected, all the breath channels are so well connected. The body is so nourished with the breath that you don't even have to breathe in and out. It's not because you're suppressing the breath. It's simply because there's no need for it. The breath energy feels full in the body. The body's oxygen needs are apparently met by the exchange at the skin. Because your mind is so still, the brain is using a lot less oxygen, So you can be very still right here without feeling any need to breathe. There are 4 jhanas, but when the Buddha talks about noble right concentration, he adds a FTH factor. He calls it having your theme well in hand. In other words, you're able to step back a little bit from what you're doing. When you're thoroughly in a state of concentration, you're here planted with the breath. There's not much thinking around that sense of oneness, aside from simply the perception that holds you there. But for the FTH factor, the Buddha gives images of a person sitting, looking at someone lying down, or of a person standing up, looking at a person sitting. In other words, your focal point shifts slightly to the mind, observing your mind as it's related to the breath. You're pulling out a little bit, using a smidgen of directed thought and evaluation, asking questions that build on the lessons you've learned about how to deal with uncomfortable breathing, how to make it more comfortable, and how to make use of that sense of comfort, and applying them directly to the mind. Now, those questions actually fall under the terms of the 4 Noble Truths. Where's the stress? What's causing it? What can be done to put an end to it? So you step back a little bit to watch the mind and apply the questions of the 4 Noble Truths to your concentration. It's at this point where you're looking not only at the breath, but also at the mind in relationship to the breath that right concentration becomes noble right concentration. You're here with one object, but you're examining it and seeing how the mind relates to objects. What does it mean to relate to an object? What kind of relationships do you have going on? What are the activities that keep these relationships going? Even when the mind is very, very still, there are still some subtle feelings and perceptions and thought constructs hovering around the object, maintaining that relationship. It's when you see this that you can go on to the next stage, which is to gain some dispassion for even this state of concentration. Prior to that, you settle into the concentration and, as the Buddha says, you indulge in it. There's nothing else you have to do, nowhere else you have to go. You're right here. And you can use that level of involvement in the concentration to help peel away a lot of really gross dilemmas, because as you leave concentration, and the mind picks up greed or aversion or delusion, you see how gross those things are. The mind inclines to not go for them because it's got a better point of view, a better perspective, coming from a better place to stay. When the dilemmas are clamoring for instant gratification, you see you've got this alternative form of pleasure, the pleasure of concentration. Right here, to feed them. You've got this comfortable way of breathing. It's free. It's immediate. It's visceral. Just that fact can help peel away a lot of the appeal of things you were attached to before. But ultimately, you use that ability to step back to take apart the concentration itself when you see that even in these really nice states of stillness, there's still some fabrication going on. There's still some inconsistency in the feelings and perceptions. Things go up and down. The level of pleasure goes up and down. The level of stress goes up and down. It's very delicate and subtle, but it's there. When the mind can see that and gain some dispassion for it, that's when it opens up to another dimension, which is not right concentration or right view. We're not here for the purpose of right view, or for any of the other factors of the path. We use them. They're all activities, even right view, which we tend to see as the mind's picture of things standing apart from its activities. We see it as the theory as opposed to the practice. That's what it seems to be, but as you actually observe your mind in action, you begin to realize that right view is not a theory apart from the practice. It's an action, and so it's part of the practice. Everything we do when we're talking about the Dhamma is all part of the practice. And all the factors come together here where the mind can observe itself carefully in stillness, and see what's worth holding on to and what's not, letting go of what's not to the point where it doesn't have to hold on to anything. That's the Kamma that puts an end to Kamma. So this is the path we're following right here as we're bringing the mind to the breath. It's a matter of being very observant of what you meet along the path. There may be some surprises. So even though the path is not what you're here for, don't keep glancing down toward the end of the path, saying, "Gee, when am I going to get there?" Say, "I'm right here." I've got to look very carefully right here where I'm placing my feet because who knows what's going to come up in the path tonight? The path and the goal are two separate things, but their duties are not separate. It's in the act of observing yourself as you develop the path that you get to realize the end of soaring. Always be alert as you walk along the path because it's the only way you get to see things you never saw before, or as the Buddha says, to attain the as yet unobtained, to reach the as yet unreached, to realize the as yet unrealized. That's what this truth is for. Choosing sides. November 8, 2013. When you read the factors of the path, one of the RST things you notice is the word right, which implies that there is also a wrong view and a wrong resolve all the way down to wrong concentration. And the Buddha doesn't leave it just implied. There are passages where he talks explicitly about wrong view and all the other wrong factors, which means you have to make a choice. It's not the case that every path leads to the top of a mountain. I don't know of any place in the world where every path leads to tops of mountains. A lot of paths lead down into Death Valley. A lot of paths lead down to the ocean or into a swamp. There are lots of different places the paths can take you, so you have to choose. Is this the path you want to follow? And the choice really does make a difference. We live in a culture where people like to have their choices inconsequential. In other words, it's simply a matter of personal taste. Do you want your enlightenment to be yellow, or would you prefer metallic gray? As if we were choosing a car. But even when you choose a car, there are consequences, and even more so with a path of practice. You've got to decide. What do you really want out of life? Once you've decided what you want, you have to decide to make it come into being. That's another aspect of the path that's really important. It's something fabricated. You have to put it together, there's work you have to do. There are things that are not arising yet that you want to make arise, and there are things that are arising that you want to learn how to stop. That's what right mindfulness and right ear are all about. Again, this is something else that we in our culture don't like to think about or even hear. Just today, I was reading an old translation of an Ajahn Chah Dhamma talk, trying to decide whether it deserved to be translated anew. Things were going along well for a couple of pages. Then all of a sudden, there was a passage where, in the original, Ajahn Chah talks about how important it is to understand the truth about dukkha, stress or suffering, and the cause of dukkha, so that you can learn how to stop the cause, and, in that way, stop suffering. But the translation said you want to learn about dukkha because that, in and of itself, would stop the suffering. The activity of doing something to stop the cause was dropped entirely. This is so typical of Western Dhamma. All you have to do is know things, accept things, and that's going to be the end of the problem, that's what they say. But the Buddha did teach right eart. And he taught right mindfulness as a guide to right eart. There are things you have to remember to work at putting an end to, and things you have to work at giving rise to. Once you've given rise to them, you have to develop them. This is all about making choices, taking sides. Which side do you want to be on, the side of right view or wrong view? Many people say that the whole point of the practice is learning how not to take sides, not to cling to views that something is right or wrong. The Buddha does talk about not clinging to views, but that's a teaching to use after right view has done its work. When you don't need right view anymore, you put it aside. But as long as you haven't gotten to the end of the path, you need to side with right view all the way down the line. It comes back to that choice. What kind of happiness do you want? We'd like to have every kind of happiness, yet if we try to scoop them all up in our arms, some of them are going to get pushed out of our grasp. Some kinds of happiness actually push the other ones out. Sometimes we end up dropping them all. So there are choices that have to be made. If you go after some kinds of happiness, other kinds of happiness just can't happen. Not all forms of happiness are harmonious and conducive to one another. You have to think about that basic principle, as the Buddha said. When you see that a greater happiness comes from letting go of a lesser happiness, you've got to let go of the lesser happiness. So while you're sitting here meditating, you're choosing. And you're making important choices. Do you want to stay with the breath? Or do you want to take this time to wander around in the world of your mind and pick flowers and gaze at the sky with no concern for where you're going? Or do you want to put it to work to develop good strong powers of concentration and good strong powers of mindfulness? Mindfulness, is not just watching things coming and going. As the Buddha said, when mindfulness becomes a governing principle in the mind, it sees things that are unskillful, and it works toward getting rid of them. It sees things that are skillful and works toward giving rise to them. It actively gets involved in making things arise and making things pass away. So you are taking sides as you practice. Hopefully, you're taking sides with the right side, right view, and all the way down to right concentration. Because it really does make a difference. When the Buddha talks about different paths, it's not that this path leads to the top of the mountain from the north, and that other path leads to the top of the mountain from the south, all leading to the same top of the mountain. In his description of paths, he says it's like seeing that some paths lead to a pit of burning embers, while some of the other paths lead to a cesspool. There's a path that leads to a beautiful place, and another that leads to a lake with a nice shore and lots of shade on the shore. In other words, there are paths to good and bad places, and there are gradations of good and gradations of bad. So you have to ask yourself, which path do you want? A lot of us we want all the nice places. But if you go to one, you miss out on the other. You could, if you wanted to, try all the paths, but it would take a long time before you were done with them. The choice is yours. So while we're here, we try to practice right concentration, right mindfulness. This is why restraint is such an important part of the practice. Realizing that some things are going to get in the way of right mindfulness and right concentration, and you have to learn how to say no to them. The choice is yours. And remember that it is an important choice. It's not simply a matter of personal preference that will be inconsequential down the line. The choices you make really do make a difference. Try to side with the right choices, so when you look back on your path, you say, this was the right path, and I'm glad I chose it. Noble Standards. May 15, 2012. The truths the Buddha taught about suffering, its cause, its cessation, and the way to its cessation are called noble truths. And the question is, what's noble about them? To begin with, they're motivated by the desire to put an end to suffering, which on the one hand may seem pretty common. Everybody tries to suffer less. Whatever people do, skillful or unskillful. If you asked them why they were doing it, they most likely would say that they're doing it to be happier, or so that there would be more pleasure and less suffering, less pain. So it's a common motivation all over the world. What's really noble about the noble truths is that they take that common motivation and move it in a noble direction. To begin with, the Buddha's standards for happiness are higher. You should look carefully at what you're doing and the actual results you're getting from what you're doing, trying to figure out how to do it more skillfully, really skillfully, so that the happiness that results is solid and sure. At the same time, you're looking for a happiness that's blameless, that doesn't harm anybody else, doesn't harm you, something that gets you out of the feeding chain. That's what makes it noble. The fact that we're looking for a happiness that's blameless. There's that story of King Pasenadi talking one-on-one with Queen Malika in their private apartment. He asked her, "Is there anyone you love more than yourself?" And of course he's hoping that she's going to say, "Yes, Your Majesty, I love you more than I love myself." And if this were in a Hollywood LM, that's probably what she would say. But this is the Pali Canon, and Malika's no fool. She says, "No, there's nobody I love more than myself." And how about you? Is there anybody you love more than you love yourself? And the king has to admit obviously that no, there isn't. That's the end of that scene. It didn't go where the king thought it would. So he leaves the palace and goes to see the Buddha, and the Buddha says, Malika's right. You could search the whole world and there'd be no one you would love more than yourself. But you also have to react that everybody else loves themselves just as earnestly as you do. And so the conclusion he draws is not that it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. The conclusion is that you should never harm anybody. This is the basis for compassion. The realization that if we're really looking for genuine happiness, our happiness can't impose suffering on others. The Buddha doesn't say why, but two reasons come to mind. One is that if your happiness depends on other people's suffering, they're not going to stand for it. They're going to do what they can to destroy it. And two, there is that simple fact of sympathy. If you see someone else's suffering because of your happiness, it places a tinge of sorrow in your happiness. Now, some people are very good at denying that tinge. That's what a psychopathic personality is. People of that sort don't care. And there's a little bit of psychopath in many of us, in the sense that we just say it doesn't matter that so-and-so is suffering because we're looking for happiness. What makes the path so noble is that we're learning how to outgrow any psychopathic tendencies we may have. You want to get really sensitive to areas in which you're causing yourself suffering and areas in which you're causing other people suffering. Suffering here doesn't mean that you're hurting their feelings. Some people will use their hurt feelings to run your life, but that's not what the Buddha's talking about. He's talking about ways in which people would actually harm you. Killing you, stealing from you, taking things that you need in order to end happiness, or even worse, getting you to engage in killing or stealing yourself. What they're doing is their business. The question for you is, are you going to follow their example, or are you going to follow the Buddha's? Are you going to avoid doing that kind of harm to yourself and others? You've got to decide that you're in this for the real thing. And part of that means you've got to raise your standards. The Buddha's approach is pragmatic. Sometimes you hear people complaining about pragmatism, that it tends to be lazy. Many pragmatists will say, if it's good enough for me, that's all I care about. That's it. So, pragmatism gets a bad rap as a lazy, self-serving approach to life. The Buddha's pragmatism is different. He says you adopt these teachings because they work, that's the pragmatism, but his standards for what works are really demanding and high. We've got to work on raising our standards to his level. This is often the hardest part of the practice. It's one of the reasons why the Buddha said that the practice starts with having admirable friends, people who have high standards. They want to help you raise your standards so that your idea of what's good enough gets stretched in the right direction. That way you begin to see areas in which you thought you were skillful and your actions were good enough, and you see that they're not really. The Buddha once said that one of the secrets to his awakening was that he didn't let himself rest content with his skillful attainments. He always pursued the question, is there a better way to do this? Are there higher standards of skill? This is where criticism is helpful, when someone you trust points out the very areas in your life where you're still unskillful. There are even times when there's someone you don't really trust, you don't trust their motives, while they're pointing this out, but they actually do point out something that's unskillful in your behavior. You've got to learn how to be a good sport, to admit the truth of their criticism and learn from it. You don't want to be demolished by the criticism. That doesn't help. But you've got to learn to look at yourself. In what way is what that person says true? Do I still have this on my behavior, in my thoughts, my words, my deeds? What can I do to overcome that awe? That determination is what keeps you on the path, and actually turns the path into a noble one. I visited a Dhamma center recently where some of the students were complaining that their teachers were constantly pulling the Buddha down to their level. For instance, the teachers were talking about how the reports of the knowledges the Buddha gained on the night of his awakening don't really sound possible. Maybe it was just a case of lucid dreaming, and we know how reliable lucid dreaming can be. Now, when you pull the Buddha down to this level, that makes him easier to dismiss. His standards lose their force, they become archetypes, and that really puts an end to the path right there. It closes the mind to the idea that maybe there are things in the human mind that are more than we can have anticipated. I remember, in encountering Ajahn Fuang, what was so radical about the experience was the sense that he did have some psychic knowledge that I had never thought possible before. It opened my mind. Maybe there's more out there than I thought possible. Maybe I can't take myself as the measure of all things. Maybe it would be good if I tried his standards. And I thought, I'm going to have to stretch myself, work harder and meditate longer. When emergencies of various kinds came, I had to learn how to drop whatever I thought was important and focus on the emergency. Sometimes it was his health, sometimes it was another problem in the monastery. A on the hillside, a sudden building or repair project that needed to be done right away. And there was a willingness to say, okay, I can stretch myself here. That's what enabled me to grow. I've told you many times about the time when Ajahn Vuang said we were going to sit and meditate all night. It was very early on in my time with him. We had worked hard all that day, at least I had been working hard all that day, and I didn't think I'd be able to handle it. And I told him as much. He looked at me and said, well, is it going to kill you? I said, no. He said, then you can do it. And I did. Much against my will, but at least I gave it a try and found that it really worked. I didn't die. And I benefited from the experience. I learned that I was capable of more than I thought. So an important part of the practice is being willing to stretch yourself. That line from Hamlet, that there's more in the universe than is dreamt of in your philosophy, really does apply to the Buddha's teachings. There's more to the Dhamma than any other philosophy can dream of. Human beings are capable of more than we ordinarily think. There are more dimensions to the mind than we would normally imagine. And so this willingness to allow yourself to be stretched. That's how you come, as the Buddha said, to realize what you've never realized before, to attain what you've never attained before. Because otherwise, if you keep on doing the same old things, you keep on attaining the same old things on the same old level that you've attained many, many times before. Nothing new ever happens, nothing new ever gets discovered. On one hand, this means being willing to listen to criticism, on the other, it means being willing to open your mind to the fact that there may be standards higher than the standards you already have. If you really want your path to be noble, you've got to stretch yourself to embody nobility. The result, of course, is that you BNT and the people around you BNT as well. This is a path whose fruits are not limited only to the person who tastes the noble fruits. It requires that you be generous, that you be virtuous, that you develop thoughts of goodwill and compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity, where they're appropriate. And that spreads the goodness around. Stop squirming. January 23, 2012. Most people who know anything about Buddhism know that the Buddha taught 4 noble truths. There's suffering, and its cause. The cause, of course, is craving, with ignorance behind a craving. Then there's the cessation of suffering and the path leading to the cessation. What's less well known is the fact that each of these truths has a task. In fact, that's why the Buddha divided them up into 4 different categories to begin with. When you encounter something, whether it's stress or craving or something that's part of the path, like mindfulness or concentration, you have to know what to do with it. You don't just watch it come or go. Stress and suffering are to be comprehended. The cause is to be abandoned. The path is to be developed so you can actually realize the cessation of suffering, so that you can experience the cessation directly. A large part of our practice lies in learning how to put these different tasks together because they have to be done together. For instance, comprehending stress and suffering. To comprehend the experience of stress and suffering, the pain, and the attachment and clinging that go with the pain, you have to watch them. You have to be able to sit with them. This requires a lot of endurance. Most of us don't like sitting with the pain. As soon as there's a pain, we move, run away. As a result, we only get little glimpses of it. Then we build up all kinds of monsters around it. It's like the monsters under your bed when you're a child. You hear a little noise under your bed, and from that one little noise you can create all kinds of monsters with fangs and scary eyes. And because you don't dare look under the bed, the monsters keep growing. It's the same with pain. It's something that drives us, and because we don't really look at it carefully or continually, it's like a taskmaster with a whip. It keeps us running, running, running. So we have to learn how to turn around and stare it down. Look at it continually to see which part is the Actual pain, in which are the imaginary monsters with the imaginary whips. This is why we develop the path. To give ourselves the strength to do that. In particular, the practice of concentration. You're mindful to stay with the breath, and then you try to evaluate and work with the breath, so that you can develop a sense of well-being. This becomes your foundation, a place where you can rest, a place you can take as your haven. And because it gives you strength, it gives you your place to take a stance, where you don't feel so threatened by pain, either physical pain or mental pain. You've got another place to go when those things seem threatening. When emotions are raging, you can go to the breath. That pulls you out of all the arguments of all the tyrant committee members in the mind. When there's physical pain in one part of the body, you can focus on the breath energy in another part of the body. This is how we build our powers of endurance. By giving ourselves a place of well-being, even in the midst of a difficult situation. There's some place we can hang on to. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to comprehend Zuering at all. When we can't comprehend it, we won't know exactly what's causing it. Actually, the Buddha divided Zuering into two sorts. There's Zuering in the Four Noble Truths, and also Zuering or stress in the three characteristics. The stress of the three characteristics is something that's simply everywhere. It's part of the fact that everything is conditioned by causes, maintained in being only for a little while, only to change. That kind of tenuous existence is inherently stressful. But fortunately, that's not the stress or Zuering that weighs the mind down. If it were, there wouldn't be anything you could do about it. What really weighs the mind down is the stress of the Four Noble Truths. The stress that comes from craving and ignorance. And that's a cause you can do something about. You can replace ignorance with knowledge. When there's knowledge of the right sort, then the craving goes away. You learn how not to indulge in craving or get involved with it. There's a passage where the Buddha compares Zuering to two arrows. The RST arrow you're shot with is the stress of the three characteristics. But then you shoot yourself with another arrow. That's the stress in the Four Noble Truths. So think about that for a minute. The Buddha was a member of the noble warrior class, and part of the knowledge of being a noble warrior back in those days was how to behave if you were shot by an arrow. In fact, the women in the class were trained to be surgeons. They knew how to extract arrows from their husbands and brothers and fathers and sons. And one of the prime instructions when you're shot with an arrow is to be still. Try not to move. The more still you are, the less damage is done. Then you try to relax around the arrow, so you can pull it out. If you tense up around it, you're just holding it in. So think of what it would mean to shoot yourself with another arrow. To begin with, there's the pain of the arrow itself, but then there's also the pain of the movement of shooting yourself. Many of us don't just shoot ourselves. We probe around inside ourselves with the arrow, making things worse. So when you're learning how to concentrate the mind, the ability to get the mind really, really still is an important part of minimizing the mental pain around whatever physical or mental pain there may be. You learn how to relax around the pain. This is why Ajahn Lee talked about knitting a part of the body that's comfortable. He compares it to a house where some of the floorboards are good and some are rotting. You don't walk on the areas where the floorboards are rotting. You don't lie down on them, because if you do, you're going to fall through. You walk or lie down on the areas where the floorboards are sound. As he points out, if there were no place in the body at all where there was a sense of ease, you'd be dead. So there must be some place. If you have trouble ending it, think about the sense of space around the body. Focus there. And every movement of the mind that would pull you away from that, just let it go, let it go. Focus on the sense of well-being that you create as you breathe in a way that feels good, breathe out in a way that feels good. And systematically go through the body. Think of relaxing it from the top down to the toes, and from the toes up to the top. Think of every pore in your skin opening up. All the little tiny muscles that hold the pores tight. Think of them opening up, opening up. Then let that sense of relaxation spread from the skin, into the body. As for the areas where you can't get a sense of relaxation or there's a sense of pain, just go around them. Don't touch them. Don't get involved with them. Think of the relaxation as a liquid seeping through the body. There are areas where it won't be able to seep. There are little rocks here and there. Okay, just go around them. That's the way of water. And we know that the way of water eventually erodes the rocks away. Then think of the breath being even more rened than that. It's like cosmic radiation. It can penetrate rocks. Think of the breath going right through. You don't have to push it through or exert any pressure. Just think of it already going right through the spaces between the atoms in the body and the spaces between the sensation points in the pain. This helps to loosen up the tendency we have to tense up around the pain. It also gives us a sense of condense. We have a source of strength in the body that's not affected by the pain, and that can actually make the pain a lot easier to deal with. When you get really good at this, then you can actually look at the pain directly. That's how you start to comprehend it. And of course, in the meantime, you've been learning things about the way the mind habitually creates more pain. It shoots you, not with just a second arrow, but a third and a fourth and a FTH. Who knows how many arrows we shoot ourselves within the course of a day? If you see yourself tempted to shoot another arrow, you can look into that. Why are you tempted to do that? And then you can stop because you know you've got a better way of dealing with the pain than shooting yourself again. This is how we develop endurance, which is one of the perfections. When the Buddha gave his summary of the Dhamma to that meeting of 1,250 monks before sending them out to teach, the RST thing he talked about was endurance, patience. That's because these are the qualities of mind that allow us to comprehend stress, to see what it really is, to the point where we actually see what we're doing that's causing it. For there to be the stress in the Four Noble Truths, there has to be a movement of the mind. And unlike the stress in the three characteristics, that movement is not necessary. It's a habit we've developed in our ignorance. So try to put the mind in a position where it can develop knowledge, the type of knowledge that watches things continually. We're not running away, not trying to push them away. Instead, we want to see. What is this experience of pain? What causes it to come? What causes it to go? What's the difference between pain in the body and pain in the mind? We tend to glom those together as well. This is why discernment is such an important part of the practice. It's learning to see these distinctions. Which kind of pain or suffering is the RST arrow? Which kind is the second arrow? How does it come? How does it go? Watching its coming and going, we're not here just to say, oh, it's coming and going, that's it. Everything is impermanent. Well, that's the end of that. Let's go on to the next one. That's not the point of what we're trying to do. You watch things come and go, so that you can guru out when pain comes, when the pain increases, what did you just do? When the pain decreases, what did you just do? You want to be able to see the connections between these things. And you see them only when you're very, very, very still. So try to develop, at the very beginning, a sense of at least a center in the body. It might be in the head, in the chest, anywhere where you feel that this is your safe haven. Learn how to maintain that sense of center, that sense of well-being in the center. Then think of that sense of well-being spreading from that spot. That way, you have your foundation, you have your standing position, where you can watch the pain and not feel threatened by it. And this way you help not only yourself but other people, too. Look at the people in the world who can't handle pain and at all the trouble they create for other people around them, people who want to help them. But there's only so much you can do for another person's pain. Even kings can't tell their followers to take their pain away from them. There's a passage in the canon where a monk is asking a king, "Do you have a recurring illness?" And the king says, "Yes, I have a recurring illness. And people sometimes stand around while I'm suffering the pain of the illness and wondering if I'm going to survive." And the monk says, "Here you are, king. Can you tell all of your followers, all of the people who work for you, to share the pain so that you can feel less of it?" The king replies, "No, I can't. I have to feel it all by myself. There's only so much other people can do when they see you're in pain. And then they just stand around and feel miserable and helpless because they can't help you any further. But if you learn how to be with your pain and not feel threatened by it, seeing the distinction between your awareness and the actual sensation of the pain, seeing the way the mind uses perceptions to create a bridge from the pain into the mind itself, and learning how to cut that bridge, then you can be with pain and not zuer. And when you're not zuering, you're not throwing yourself on other people for help. You're less of a burden, not only to yourself, but also to the people around you. This is why learning how to face pain is such an important skill. And why it's important to develop the powers of endurance and patience that enable you to watch what's going on. We're not here just to endure. As one of the forest Ajahn said, if it were simply a matter of endurance, chickens would have been awakened long before we were, because they can sit for really long periods of time, much longer than we can. We endure so that we can understand, so we can see things from a steady point of view. If your point of view is moving around all the time, then you're not going to be able to detect subtle things. It's only when your gaze is really still that you can see subtle things moving. It's like going out at night and sitting very still, watching the moon go behind a tree. You realize that you can watch the moon move. You can see it move, even though it's very slow and very subtle, it's moving all the time. But to see that, you have to be perfectly still. The movements of the mind are even more subtle than the movement of the moon, so you have to get very still around your core, where you feel at ease with a sense of nourishment, a sense of refreshment. Learn how to maintain that core and protect it, without closing up around it. Think of it as a little spot that's radiating well-being inside you, in all directions, and allow that sense of radiant well-being to whatever parts of the body that are open to its influence. That will give you the foundation you need for the endurance and steadiness of gaze, that will enable you to comprehend zuering to the point where you can abandon its cause, and realize its cessation. That's what the practice is all about. Between either and or. November 21, 2012. Ajahn Fuang said that when he went to stay with Ajahn Mun, he was very afraid of Ajahn Mun, because Ajahn Mun was very hard to predict. One of the monks might get sick and ask Ajahn Mun for some medicine. And Ajahn Mun would give him a stern lecture about taking refuge in medicine. "Why aren't you taking refuge in your practice?" he would say. Another monk would get sick and he wouldn't ask for medicine, and Ajahn Mun would criticize him. "Hey, we've got the medicine. Why aren't you using it?" As Ajahn Fuang said, it sounded like you were going to get criticized no matter what you did. But after staying with Ajahn Mun for a while, he began to realize that there was a pattern. If the medicine was there, you would use it. If it wasn't there, you may do with what you did have. In other words, you'd make do with your practice. That's the kind of thing you learn by watching your teacher and living with the teacher over time. As the Buddha said, there are a lot of things you're going to learn only by spending a lot of time with a teacher and being very observant, and in particular, getting a sense of just right in the practice. The Buddha talks about the middle path, or the middle way, from the very beginning of his teachings. What's interesting, though, is that even though he presents this as one of the most important principles of his teachings, he doesn't explain it very much. In his RST sermon, he says that the middle way is the way that avoids the extremes of sensual indulgence and self-torture. But there are very few passages in the canon where he talks about what makes the middle way middle. There are other passages where he talks about how the teaching on dependent co-arising avoids certain extremes, but these are very subtle extremes. The extremes of existence or non-existence, in other words, the labels that we place in the mind, saying that things exist or don't exist. Or the labels that would say that the person acting is one thing, the person receiving the results is somebody else, or is the same person. That's another set of extremes avoided by dependent co-arising. Those are pretty subtle. Even more subtle is the passage where the Deva comes to ask the Buddha, "So, how did you cross over the stream?" And the Buddha said, I crossed without moving forward and without staying in place, and of course, that totally befuddles the diva. It's a very subtle avoidance of the extremes of either doing something new or sticking with what you're doing, moving to a new place or staying where you are. It's an important principle, but, again, it's one that's not explained. It's one you have to learn through the practice. Because all too often we're like the Buddha himself. He started out with a life of extreme sensual indulgence. When he realized that that wasn't going to lead to true happiness, what did he do? He went to the opposite extreme, self-torture. You see this a lot among former addicts who come to the Dhamma. They indulged in alcohol, they indulged in drugs, and now they're going to indulge in starving themselves, trying to deny all kinds of sensual pleasure. Well, neither extreme, as the Buddha pointed out, is going to work. It's easiest to think in extremes because extremes can be expressed in short sound bites. The middle way requires being very observant, experimenting, and developing a sense of what's the just right point in the practice. There's some confusion about this coming from the Thai language. The word for just right in Thai is for dai, which literally means enough good. And many people will interpret that as good enough, which means, okay. You don't have to try to be really good, just good enough. But that's not what the Ajahns are really saying when they say you should do things for dai. For dai means you have to nd the point that's just right, and sometimes just right requires a lot more than good enough. Sometimes it lies outside of the box entirely. Like the Buddha's approach to pleasure and pain. It's not that you try to nd a middling point where each pleasure and pain gets neutralized. You pursue certain pleasures, the pleasures of jhana, the pleasures that come from mastering virtue and concentration, generosity, so that you can use them. Use the pleasure of concentration to put the mind in the proper mood and the proper frame of mind, making it stable enough so it can really see things in a balanced way. And often this requires a lot of concentration pleasure to get the mind tamed, not just little middling doses. At the same time, the Buddha has you use pain. Pain is a noble truth when you use it as a noble truth. In other words, you use it to understand. What's the mind doing around the pain? Sometimes you'll gain this understanding with subtle pains, and sometimes it requires more extreme ones, when the mind is cornered and can't nd any other way out, aside from sharpening its discernment into what your perceptions are doing to build a bridge from the pain into the mind. So instead of having you pursue pleasure and pain as goals in and of themselves, the Buddha has you use them as tools. That's an entirely different kind of approach. We're not looking for a middling path that's halfway between pleasure and pain. We're looking for a new way to approach both pleasures and pains. You have to keep this in mind all the time as you're practicing. Where is the just right point in what you're doing? Sometimes it's outside the box. If you're the sort of person who's been angry, you might say, well, I need to be really loving and compassionate, and you try being a Pollyanna for a while, and you realize that doesn't work. So you go thrashing back and forth, feeling that you're either too passive or too aggressive. It's not the passivity or the being aggressive that's the issue. It's what your intention is when you're dealing with people. Look at the Buddha. In some cases he would totally avoid getting into arguments, and in other cases he'd pursue an argument and be really aggressive. So you have to realize there was something else going on. The passivity or the aggressiveness was not the issue. It was his intention. His intention was kind. At the same time, he'd have a sense that some people would be just a waste of time. They were in the argument simply to win, to make points. They weren't trying to learn anything. Those were the people he'd avoid. Like the Brahmin who came to see him one time and asked, "What kind of teaching do you teach?" The Buddha sensed that the Brahmin was looking for a GHT, and so he responded, "I teach the sort of doctrine where people don't get into useless arguments." That was the end of that. But then there was the case of Sakaka, who came to make the Buddha sweat and shake, as he said. And he ended up being the one sweating and shaking because of the Buddha's aggressive response to his arguments. Sakaka was trying to say that everybody knows that form, feelings, perceptions, fabrications, and consciousness are yourself. And the Buddha picked his argument apart, to the point where Sakaka really lost face, in front of all the people that he, Sakaka, had brought along to watch his victory. So the issue is the intention. But then again, you can't take that as a soundbite teaching either, because there are certain actions the Buddha said are inherently unskillful, and you have avoid those. If intention were everything, you could say, well, I have compassionate intention in whatever. Killing, stealing, having illicit sex, all the way down the line. But skillfulness doesn't work that way. In some areas there's a very clear right and wrong. Just like those bear awareness signs in Alaska. There are some areas with very clear dos and don'ts. For example, as the Buddha pointed out, killing is never skillful. Stealing is never skillful. Illicit sex is never skillful. Lying is never skillful. Divisive speech, coarse speech, idle chatter. There are a few cases in those three where you can engage in them, but you have to know a sense of moderation. This doesn't mean that you do them a little bit. You engage in them only when you're confident that your intention is skillful, when you have to speak harshly with somebody to get that person's attention, when you have to warn people about someone who could take advantage of them, or when you have to engage in friendly chatter to keep the group going smoothly. But those are areas where you have to be very, very careful. In terms of the mind, the Buddha said, inordinate greed, ill will, wrong views are never right. So these are areas where there's a clear right and wrong. But then there are a lot of areas where right is at that point of just right in the middle. That's where you have to watch for your intention, you have to watch for the results that you're expecting and that you actually get. Here is where it's good to have good examples, which is one of the reasons why we have the monastic Sangha. The Buddha didn't write meditation manuals and hand them out. He set up a monastic Sangha so that there would be people living together and learning the kinds of lessons that you learn from living with people who are further along in the path, seeing how they handle different situations. The lessons you pick up by osmosis, by using your powers of observation. So there are no easy sound bites for finding the middle way. It's a body of knowledge that you pick up as you practice, as you live with other people who are practicing and are further along on the path. This way, you learn how to look at incidents and choices from a wide variety of perspectives. In the beginning, it's awkward because you end yourself choosing the wrong issues to focus on in particular situations at particular times. But over time, if you're really observant and willing to learn and willing to listen, you get a better and better sense of this point of just right. It's like people going to live in the wilds of Alaska. The people who survive are the ones who are not doctrinaire. They're the ones who figure out what works and what doesn't work. Sometimes some modern gear is very useful, and other times you want to stick with the old ways of doing things. And how do you know which is which? Through experimentation and also through learning from people who have been there before. Some areas have clear do's and don'ts. Other areas are like that very last item on the bear awareness sign, where the bear has attacked you and is chewing on you. You have to decide, is this bear chewing on me out of curiosity or out of hunger? If he's chewing out of curiosity, just lie there playing dead, and the bear will lose interest and go away. But if the bear is chewing out of hunger, you've got to GHT for all you're worth. Now, how are you going to know the bear's intention? You have to be very sensitive, very alert, very mindful, right at a point where most people are losing their minds entirely. This is one of the reasons why we practice. To put the mind in a position where it can learn these subtle lessons of where just right is even in difficult situations. Be willing to drop some of your doctrinaire ideas that everything has to be either this or that. The Buddha himself gave good lessons in this area when he was answering questions. People would ask him to come down on one side or the other of a question, and in some cases he would. In others he'd say, no, this is not a question that deserves a categorical answer. It might deserve an analytical answer. It might deserve to be put aside if the question was framed in totally the wrong way. So not everything is either or. As it turns out, many of the most important issues are the ones where the answer is in between the either or the or, and you have to end exactly right where that is. As you practice, it gets more and more subtle. As I said, this distinction between the way the mind slaps the label of existence or non-existence on things, or the choices that it forces on itself to move or stay. Are you going to keep framing your choices in the same way, or are you going to think outside the frame? Sometimes the right answer is one of two alternatives, sometimes it's right between the two alternatives, sometimes it's the continuum entirely. So to develop that kind of sensitivity, you need to look for the point of just right in everything you do. It's only in this way that your sense of just right gets more and more on target in taking you nearer to the goal. In harmony with the Buddha's guidance, we stress the immense importance of sharing wisdom expansively. Presently, we've transformed this extensive 1,000-page work into a readily accessible audio format. The duty to advance this noble cause now lies with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the widespread dissemination of these teachings, benefiting numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of knowledge sharing and the cultivation of mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We extend an invitation for you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can bring profound positive change to the lives of many.